6 years ago, I thought I was going to die. And I had no idea why. At school, I had this nickname, Dr. Alexx. People would come to me with all sorts of problems they might have, and for some reason, I was always the one who had the answer. But this time, I didn't have an answer. There were a few niggles in the years leading up, but in 2016, things got really freaky. I started to notice my heart a little bit more until I started to get full-blown palpitations, ectopic beats, flutters, and a couple of times it stopped just for a couple of seconds and then started up again. And I wondered, is this the point at which you call an ambulance? But my son was sleeping in the room next door and I was trying to figure out how I'd do that with my husband working that night. Then the neurological symptoms started. First, it was the odd twitch in my limbs, and then I was lit up like a Christmas tree 24/7. I started to have spasms and tremors. My arm would just fly up, and I would not be doing that. I started to have ice pick pain, weird issues with my tongue where it felt like I had to deliberately move it to speak. Dr. Google is not fun in these moments because I started to do some research online while my initial appointment with my doctor and naturopath brought up nothing. I started to ask myself, maybe it's ALS, maybe it's Parkinson's, maybe it's MS, maybe it's Maybelline. Sorry, humour is definitely a coping mechanism of mine. It was a really, really dark time. Eventually, after a year of every test, scan, appointment that you could possibly go to, blood work where there were 14 tubes every time it got drawn, I finally found a chronic illness specialist overseas. And in filling out the patient intake form, there was a question that changed my life. Have you ever noticed any mould in the house you're living in or in any of the previous homes you've lived in your life? Yes. Yes, I had, here and there. In fact, in the 2 homes before the one we were living in as well. In fact, in 2 of our childhood homes. In fact, in a holiday house that we used to go to every year when I was a kid, and I would always get really sick the first week I was there. Whoa, that was a big question. And after that appointment, a few more tests, and our second appointment, I had a diagnosis. Chronic inflammatory response syndrome. It's a multi-system illness. It's caused by biotoxins, and there are over 30 known symptoms. I had 37. I was relieved. It was like the best bad day of your life where you finally have something to work with. So I started researching. Surely someone's spoken about this. Back online I go. I find Erin Brockovich, I find Muhammad Ali, I find Bianca Jagger, I find Susan Summers, all celebrities who had battled toxic black mould in their homes and either had to completely vacate, burn down, reconstruct. It was all there in these newspaper reports. And then locally, I found politicians, banking executives who were sharing their stories around these mouldy homes. I wondered if there were doctors helping. So I started to look for a doctor who might be able to see me through this journey, and I found Dr. Richie Shoemaker in America, who it turns out had helped thousands of patients over decades of his career with a protocol that he honed over time and that he had taught doctors around the world to try and help patients while the science still wasn't showing up with a consensus. I then found papers, research, Dale Bredesen, an incredible doctor in the Alzheimer's space, who linked mould to a particular type of Alzheimer's. There were papers linking mould to ALS, to MS, to Parkinson's. There was a psychiatrist, Dr. Mary Ackley, who described her mould patients as having a brain on fire. And I cried when I read her paper called Brain on Fire, because I finally felt like someone had seen me in a time where my husband was looking on hopelessly. I couldn't really explain things to friends and family because I didn't even understand what was going on. I felt like my body had betrayed me, but I felt like the tide was about to turn. We were going to make friends and work on this. I also wondered if there were any support groups, and that's when I found the Toxic Mould Support Group on Facebook. I mean, is that not the sexiest thing you've ever heard? But there were thousands of us on there. We were everywhere trying to figure out this disease. And unfortunately, I've misspoken there. It's not a disease because it's not a consensus. Therefore, it's called a syndrome, kind of like chronic fatigue syndrome, where there isn't a consensus on how to diagnose, how to treat, and how to cure. So I find all these people, we start talking, I start having them on my podcast, which I'm oh so grateful to have. And one of our local doctors who champions mould illness patients, Dr. Sandeep Gupta, has in fact joined me a couple of times, and he's an amazing man doing work with many people in the Northern Rivers right now. So after all the binge reading, I actually had to do something. I got to work. We had to move. We had to find a dry home. Now, this was 6 years ago, and we've moved 9 times in 6 years. In fact, there was one 15-month period where we moved 7 times. Now, imagine, like we know, right? You've read the surveys where moving house is like one of the top 5 most stressful things a human being says that they go through in their lives. So imagine being incredibly unwell, trying to look for a house, trying to decide which items you can pack, trying to figure out the finances as you replace all the mattresses, the couches, the pillows, the cushions, anything with soft furnishings that mould can grow into has to go. And doing that 9 times. And trying to continue your treatment and your work. I spoke to people in the Toxic Mould Support Group just last week, actually, saying, guys, I've done the sums. I'm giving this talk on the weekend, and it turns out we've spent, as a small family of 3, $100,000 in the last 6 years on mould and trying to get away from it and trying to get better. And again, I wasn't alone. Everybody started to share their stats. One woman spent 30 grand last year. Another one had spent up to $500,000 in 20 years because the first 18 years she had no idea what she was chasing, and nor did anyone she was working with. I could go on and on with the stories. The interesting thing with this chronic inflammatory response syndrome is that there is a genetic link. And Dr. Shoemaker estimates that there are about 25% of us who can't recognise mould as a toxin, bind and remove. And so, as mycologist David Lark says, the biotoxins that the mould spores give off, we call them mycotoxins, actually hit our innate immune system and cause massive amounts of dysregulation. So this was another penny dropping because my husband was fine through all of this. And this can make it really difficult for partners looking on. But it also made sense why my son had all of his nosebleeds, why he had constant congestion, why we called him Mr. Snuffleupagus when he was a little toddler, which was kind of endearing. But now looking back, it was like, oh, I just wish I'd known. Because mould has been shown to affect the brain in such a way that development isn't always a smooth road, especially with fine motor skills and concentration. So, yes, it's big, and yes, I now know what to do. So if you think about how to live when you have sirs. I have become a dust ninja. I have become a humidity ninja. Things that I really never thought I would become. But dehumidifiers are literally my favourite, most precious resource. I run them during the day in our bedrooms when it's raining. I run them in the bathrooms after our showers. I run them in the laundry if it's raining and we can't hang our clothes out. I've become a ninja on leaks. We check cracked tiles. We replace grouts straight away if it's chipped, because otherwise water can go under tiles and start growing mould right there under your bathroom. I've learnt so much, and I feel like there is still so much work to do. And really the thing that I have a huge issue around and am campaigning for today, along with other activist groups as we start to join forces, is trying to get people to care more about mould. We have buildings being built with flat roofs and no eaves because they look pretty. No, that's not a good idea. Bring back the eaves, bring back the pointy roofs. I have a builder friend who says every house is going to get wet. It's about how quickly it can dry out. So we need to completely rethink design. And then I think about home maintenance. Do you have a checklist that anyone's ever given you where you know every 6 months I have to check for cracked tiles, I have to check my gutters, I have to service my air conditioning system? People are always shocked in talks and workshops that I give when I say 6 months, a year, absolute max, you need someone to come in and fully clean your air conditioning system. Otherwise, black mould starts to spray itself all around your house. Shock. We don't have these protocols. We have our fire person that comes and checks the alarms are working every year. We need that when it comes to keeping our buildings dry. And the thing is, while we wait for everybody to agree, it's interesting to look back in time because we've actually been here before. 2,000 years ago, an ancient Roman scholar reported that the miners working in the asbestos mines were getting really, really sick and dying. 2,000 years later, in 2003, Australia finally bans asbestos. Is mould the new asbestos? Because if you go back 2,000 years, in the Bible, Leviticus Chapter 13 and 14, on the seventh day, if the mildew has spread through the material, it will be burned, says the priest. On the seventh day, if the green and red mildew that has been seen on the stones is still there, the stones must be removed and placed outside the town. Should have called the priest. So please, why do we keep having to wait 2,000 years? And why do we keep having to have a bunch of people get sick before we actually start to do something? My journey has only been 6 years long, and in that time, even in the darkest time, I found space for gratitude for my friends who came to scary medical appointments, for my husband who sprung into action with anything and everything that was needed, with all of the crazy stuff we've had to do. For my friends who took my boy after school when I just did not have the energy to get up. And gratitude that I can actually do something about this illness and that I have a platform to help more people know about it so that you can get help too. I have huge amounts of gratitude for the doctors working while waiting for a consensus to help their patients however they possibly can. I have a huge amount of gratitude for the people out there in trauma land and trauma work helping to repair the nervous system, just as the rest of our physical body needs to heal. There is a long way to go with mould before we see consensus, before we see more of a broad understanding and an agreement on what to do across industries. But boy, am I grateful, joyful, in fact, to be here with you today to turn the page on the story of mould. to the next one. Thank you.